moderate again, which is very exciting, particularly with the two. So there was this thing, harness generative collective intelligence, and I'll say that this is a little bit of a beginning of that with the collective intelligence to either side of me. Many of you know Edgar and Bridi, but just to give a really brief introduction, Edgar is the founder and director of the African Center for Cities. It works on art, urban planning, urban system change, leadership, really thinking of cities in thinking and acting and changing and working with people in cities in a very different way. I've known Edgar for maybe 15 years now, which is sort of horrifying about all the gray hair we have through the Indian Institute of Human Settlements. But collective intelligence, cities, that's where Edgar's coming from. And Bridi is the CEO of Development Intelligence. She's worked across public, private, nonprofit worlds, ranging from the bilateral legal cooperation in the Australian Attorney General's office to public sector consulting to many other worlds. So I'm very happy to be with the two of them. And I'm just going to basically steal from Jean and ask both of you, one after the other, what challenged you about yesterday? What were some of the tensions that you saw that you deal with in your everyday work and may have some advice for all of us? Edgar, what challenged you yesterday?
Thanks, Jessica. Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Jessica, and thanks for the organizers for inviting me. So it was a mistake that there was alcohol available last night because I probably had one too many. And as a result, my grand plans to prepare for this morning by getting up early went awry because I couldn't de-loop from sort of thinking about what to say. And it was really a reflection of the enormous amount of stimulus we received yesterday, and a lot of it was very challenging, it was complex, and of course, if nothing else, just the multivocality of accents alone is enough to keep one awake at night. But what really struck me and what sort of kept me awake in some senses, and it wasn't just the whiskey, was I think where we started yesterday morning with the administrator's challenge that the work of development is not done. That in fact, if anything, what the moment calls for is a fundamental rethink about what is this enterprise that is at the heart of UNDP's mission. And that was bookended for me by what I thought was one of the most poetic and one of the most profound provocations that I've received in a convening like this in a long time by Kirikowai Mikaere from the National Iwi Chairs Council, or the Forum. And there was something about the elegance in the simplicity of the factual nature of what it means to think about the future from the moment of profound and intergenerational systemic violation. And I want to invite us to think about these two bookends as a way of maybe stepping a little bit back from the 6 principles and maybe asking a few more foundational questions about what are the kinds of knowledges that we need to inhabit to do this work of imagining alternative futures and pathways to get there. And there's 3 clusters that became clear to me. The one is there's a number of unspeakable things that we gloss over because they are just too unbearable and too painful and too challenging because we don't have answers for them. We don't even have an ethical framework to think about what to do with them. And with this, I have in mind the routinization of large-scale violence and extortion and the erasure of bodies and memories and cultures. And of course, just on my continent, the DRC conflict has been raging for 20 years. Over 15 million bodies decimated in a completely unspoken genocide in the current moment. And of course, we, on a daily basis, live with the reality of Palestine on our cell phones as witnesses to another genocide that really speaks fundamentally to the impotence of the multilateral system in the current moment. If we think of the climate crisis, it's again unspeakable in the sense of those in the world who are insured to, in some ways, mitigate or respond to the impacts, and the billions who are uninsured, who simply have no prospect of being able to navigate what that means. It is a level of short-term, already visible injustice that is very hard for us to even utter, to speak in clear terms in the way that I heard yesterday. And then there's the reality of disposable nations. 32 of the 44 least developed countries in the world are on the African continent. We're talking about 1.1 billion people. If we broaden the definition to lower middle income countries, we're talking about 5.1 billion people on the planet. The LDCs on the African continent have zero prospect of transitioning into a position where they can offer prosperity to their people. Zero, absolutely zero, because of the rules of the game with regard to international finance, with regard to trade, with regard to a fundamental political disempowerment and an erasure of sovereignty to make decisions about national resources. This is a fact. I can show you the data over the last 40 years of liberalization that the GDP per capita has stalled for 40 years. This is now. And it represents an erasure of bodies that is incredible. And of course, what these three things aggregate to is a scale of inequality that we've never seen in civilization, and it is getting worse as all of us are doing our work. So what does it mean to inhabit a disposition to think about what development might be when there are these large chunks of knowledge and practice and routine being that is unspeakable within these forums? To come to development as a second category of knowledge, it is very clear to us now, 4 years out from 2030, that the SDGs, in some ways, is a moribund knowledge set. Because what it does is, in its tendency to a reliance on a managerialism to help us navigate priorities, directionality, and so forth, it has stripped away the essence of what the development program should be about. Not as in UNDP, but as in the universal journey of humanity. And I want to suggest that maybe it's time to be much more radical. What if we just focus on one cluster of things? What if we say we become custodians of the first 1,000 days in the lives of everyone that will be born from 2015 to 2030? And we try and reimagine what it will take institutionally to really attend to three things in those first 1,000 days. One, to realize the potential of every child, because we know cognition and the capacity for cognitive development is formed through nutritional intake and stimuli between the ages of 1 and 3. And if most of the children of the 5.1 billion people I spoke about don't have access to early childhood development in those formative years, we are indicting them to a non-future effectively, let alone AI, just in terms of even the potential to learn. Secondly, is this question of education and learning. What should the curriculum be, given all of the things we're talking about? And lastly, how do we imagine place, where people grow up, where they become? If we triangulate between these three things, potential, learning, and place, we settle on a beautifully evocative phrase of Arjun Appadurai called the capacity to aspire. What if development is just that? Is to foster the capacity to aspire in every single person. The last set of knowledge for me is the cool stuff that we've been talking about, right? Is the new architectural forms and so on. But my provocation and the challenge for me is how do we take that first set of knowledge of the unsayable, the second knowledge of distilling the essence of the developmental challenge as the mandate for rethinking the institutional redesign question, right? What happens then? It leaves us with a very difficult position because it demands a kind of paradoxical disposition where we are able to move between the imponderable, the abyss, and being able to intervene in the specificity of the everyday and the intimacy of institutions that we currently inhabit. That means we've got to simultaneously have a humility, have an openness, but also be filled with a constant rage at the systemic nature of intergenerational violence and injustice. So this for me is sort of the big takeaway that I was left with last night. thinking between those two bookends of what happened yesterday. And then I think it does cast a very different light on where we are and the discussions we're going to have today about what might be the first principles of development. Secondly, how do we think value and exchange in the context of the next economy? What is that? What is being valued? And lastly, is there a way that the ethical core of what comes next could potentially be intergenerational, but also interspecies justice, right? And that then lands us with three very, very concrete values that are both dispositions, but they're also institutional imperatives. And I would argue there are reparations, redistribution, and recognition. I'm happy to explore what that might add up to in terms of the detail of the conversation of today. But I leave you with those three provocations of reparations, redistribution, and recognition in the context of the 5.1 billion people that are basically indispensable to what comes next in a oligarchic, techno-bro-driven world that we are all collectively moving into. Thank you.
Thank you. So while I think that there might have been some structural similarities between what Edgar just said and the talk we had last night from Kim Stanley Robinson in the sense of a litany of statements about reality that create a challenge for institutional innovation, what I really appreciate about that, and I want to sort of emphasize as the challenge for all of us, is bringing in the personal disposition, this combination of humility and rage, the sense of agency, but acknowledgement of the magnitude of the dynamics that we are all within. I know I struggle with this, and often, actually, as sort of a middle-aged woman, I sometimes cry, not out of necessarily unhappiness, but out of recognition of the deep, moving part of being part of these changes and trying to redirect the river. So thank you for that challenge. Bridi, over to you. What challenged you yesterday? And what do you want to put back to the group?
Yeah, thanks, Jess. And Edgar, listening to you right now, a lot of those big macro challenges were something that were really resonating with me as well as I watched the speeches being put out there. Like issue.
Not the intention.
I see the plan at play here. But we overcame it. How innovative of us. Edgar, listening to you speak just now, I think that those macro level challenges also really resonated with me. But so too did something that I felt was a tension that at least I was seeing, but I didn't always hear it voiced in a lot of the sessions yesterday. And really that tension that I was watching in a lot of the sessions went something along the lines of exactly what happened in this audience as Edgar was speaking about these macro level challenges. What you were doing as he spoke right now was you were seeing those challenges and your eyes were lighting up, hearing somebody name the sorts of worries or concerns that you were also concerned about. But then what I also saw in the audience was a level of overwhelm as well. And then what I heard yesterday as we all went on that journey, seeing the level of disruption in the world, that feeling of overwhelm was then a piece of kind of paralysis. And in the questions then came out this resounding, but what do I do next? And so one of the tensions and the challenges that I really took from yesterday is how do we, at the same time, hold two opposite emotions in our heads and how do we act on it? On the one hand, how do we see the complexity and the magnitude of the challenges out there? But on the other hand, within our institutions, how do we take just one key next step to try and grapple with them? And I think that for me, when I'm thinking about that overwhelm, or we call it inside of our lab, we call it analysis paralysis. Our foreign minister once stared down the barrel at us and said, "My God, you must stop admiring the problems here. We need to act on the solutions." And so one of the things that I think is sometimes helpful amidst this macro overwhelm within our institutions, or I love that, within the processes that we are institutionalizing, I think one of the really key things we need to be doing is asking ourselves whether or not we are having honest conversations within our own institutions. And just practically, one way that I think can help is to recognise that as project leaders, as leaders of organisations and beyond, really when we're faced with this extraordinary macro picture of disruption, no matter what, we really face three options. And sometimes we do not see these choices ahead of us, right? Option one in the face of grand disruption is that we continue on business as usual. And those that take that option either have their heads in the sand or they have institutions that are built for this disruption. So option number one in an honest conversation is, do we continue what we are doing? Do we continue in the status quo? But leaders also face a second option, and that is, where can we adapt? Perhaps your organisation needs to adapt first and foremost in response to a climate change disruption, or perhaps it's financial or something else. But leaders faced with grand disruption can either continue on in the status quo, they can adapt their institutions where it matters most, or thirdly, they may choose to transform entirely, right? But this is challenging for us as humans, because to let go of the thing that worked for us 2 or 3 years ago, just because it may not work in the future, is easier said than done. So the challenge that I think really resonates for me the most is not the big sexy principles out there about harnessing shared intelligence from the playbook. That is critical, that's important, that's what we do day to day. But I think the existential challenge is actually principle number 4. Can we, whilst embracing the complexity of disruptions out there, be serious about prioritising simplicity enough that we actually feel like we can act on these disruptions? And for me, there are lots of ways to do this, but number 1, I feel like honest institutional conversations about whether or not we are going to continue the status quo, how we are going to deliberately adapt just 1 or 2 things, or whether we should or we can transform our institutions. For me, that's where it really starts. It's that honest conversation about how to act.
Thank you. One of the things that I love about both of these interventions is the weaving back and forth of the human, the emotional, the feeling of being in a moment with the institutional, or the sense of some kind of codification of relationships. And it reminds me a little bit of a book that I was just reading, Under the Watchful Eye of the Big Bird, by a Japanese author whose name I forget, but I think I've been recommending it to everyone I've been speaking to. But one of the things in the end is there's sort of an intelligence that's reflecting back on what happened around this period of time. And the intelligence, which is partially human, partially non-human, is kind of speaking to the humans and saying, one of the things that I really love about your species is the ability to hold conflicts, to be confused amongst yourselves, to be simultaneously optimistic and to know that you're going extinct, to be able to hold 3 different viewpoints within one of your heads. This is unique, and this is something that you need, that is the reason that I had an interest in trying to keep you alive for so long. It's a beautiful book, much more beautiful than these words, that I think contemplates a lot of these issues. But the big question here for both of you, I mean, I was thinking yesterday about these tensions that were coming up between how do you get started when the horizons are fuzzy? How do you formalize when most of the knowledge is informal? How do you acknowledge the gravity of the status quo but overcome it and launch yourselves? How do you respect the status quo as the accumulation of well-meaning, often well-intentioned things from the past? How do you keep an eye on the possibilities, and how do you keep a center on creativity, but not disrupt and create instability and insecurity of constant change? How do you maintain creative tension, but diminish conflict? All of these are human things. People as individuals, we can do these things. It's how to institutionalize it. So after that long intervention myself, I think the question for each of you is there a specific example of keeping the human in the institution, the multi-human entity with some rules that you can think of that might be something that we can hold on to as we try to move into the world that you are envisioning when we speak about the unspeakables? Do you have an example that we can come back to?
Yeah, thanks. So part of the work that I do is a leadership program with African mayors and governors. And the program is 3 years old now, and we have 15 leaders every year in the cohort. We work together for 10 months. And in my career, it's by far been the most humbling and grounding work that I've done. And, yesterday when we were going through the playbook and the sort of incredible array of experience and techniques and institutional technologies we were exposed to, in my mind's eye, I kept on going back to Nansana. It's a district in Uganda. And the mayor, Florence, was on the program 2 years ago. She has 460,000 people in her territory. Most of them are very, very poor, don't have employment. Informal employment is around 93%. And it will double in size in just the next 10 to 15 years. And she has 1 solid waste management truck for 460,000 people. And, so you sit with her and you say, okay, there's no way to move, right, to take Bridi's point. Like, what's the next move? And she came out of the 4-day program, and she was crystal clear in her mind. She was going to go back home. She was going to work with women's sewing clubs. She was going to get young people uniforms. And they were going to engage in a tree planting exercise because there needed to be a societal mindset shift about waste. Even if they can't afford a second truck, at least what she can do is to collectively mobilize her people and her communities to build a set of social infrastructures that can begin to fundamentally alter the cultural relationship with public space and with waste and so on. And she keeps on, we keep a running WhatsApp group with the mayors and so on, and every week she's posting more and more pictures of her with these young people and so on. And the point that I'm trying to make is that I think it is absolutely critical and important that we have this really sophisticated and wide-ranging portfolio of institutional transformation techniques. But what often sits at the core of that is the resource pool to put a team together that is going to drive the change management process, that is going to hold the experimentation, distill the learning, codify the learning, help to build the sort of adaptive move that Bridi was talking about. But in places where those are just not even on the table of a set of options, there's still a whole bunch of stuff to do, which fundamentally boils down to saying, with the people as the primary resource and people's commitment to community and collective action and solidarity, how do we forge new identities of citizenship? And how do we concretize that and build a set of rituals and a set of affective experiences for people to make these things real, right? Even if there's no money whatsoever. And what is fascinating to conclude that example is that because of this work, she's now being recognized as this leader that kind of conjures magic out of nothing. And there's now a whole bunch of partners and so on that is trying to work with her to build more institutional frameworks to really begin to solve the underlying systemic issues around solid waste and building a circular economy framework, all the cool stuff, that we would all be familiar with. But the starting point was recognition that this was something she cared about deeply. She translated her passion into a set of opportunities for people to work with her and to collectively conjure an intervention that was extremely frugal by definition, but was resonant in terms of that local community. And that's kind of, just one story to perhaps talk about how one can still move forward, make that next move, even in a context of extreme scarcity and overwhelming set of challenges.
And one challenge that it occurs to me stems from that is the challenge in rooms like this of recognizing those kinds of human institutional innovation, that kind of collective intelligence and formation. I was struck by the word resonance.
Yeah.
But at the same time, do more than recognize and support, fund, make sure that the resources flow. That's a financial mechanism, procurement, changing. There are lots of institutional details in that. But I think we just heard this story, making those visible without consigning them to always be unsupported and inspiring.
Yeah.
The support part, how do we ensure institutionalized support and respect for that kind of innovation is a big challenge for us. So I'll just put that back onto the room. Turn to Bridi. So humans in institutions, an example.
I think it's a really interesting question that we face at the moment, because I think that there's a risk, as all of us grapple with AI and machine learning and these big disruptions, that we fall into the trap of thinking that organizations are in fact making decisions and instead forget that there are humans inside entities like the UN, like the Australian government or elsewhere, who are still holding the ultimate decision-making power. And certainly at a very, very, very small level, one of the things that we've been doing back in Australia has been to work very, very closely alongside the Australian government as it has been building out its new international development strategy, and just about 12 hours ago handing down its new development budget as well. And I've got to say, as a think tank, the prototype of how I originally thought we would do this kind of work was so traditional. I thought, wow, if we just publish better insights, we put together better reports, we email it to the right people, then maybe we would be able to influence these key decision makers around the future direction of my nation's foreign affairs portfolio. And luckily, we did not take that traditional approach. We paused first, and we put the human back into it. And in speaking to 100 different policymakers, certainly in Australia, but you can replicate this out, particularly in lower and middle income countries that work in this very human and relational kind of way. What we actually discovered was that these really big key decisions about the future direction of something were rarely made in a boardroom. They were often made in a taxi. They were rarely made off the basis of a formal report, but they may have been made off the back of somebody briefing a minister in an airport lounge. And so what we started to do was actually break down and map the feelings at the heart of key decision makers, and then design specifically how we would engage our writing, our briefing, our roundtable type designs, so much so that in fact when we hold a conversation with government, it is in a warehouse, it is candle lit, because we discovered that better conversations happen by the side of a fire. It is held under rules where every single person walks into that space on a first name basis. Their duty is to make sure the person next to them has a drink and food at all times. And so for us, actually putting the human back at the heart of how decisions are being made has actually been really key to how we work with senior policymakers who otherwise we kind of think of as holier than thou and somehow representing some big organizational identity that thinks for them, and instead by connecting with them in a very human way, we're finding that we can bring our collective intelligence in a much more impactful way to the way that they make decisions. But I know that we're super tight on time, and I actually had a question for you. Do we have time, or do we need to wrap this up?
We have 5 minutes and 1 second.
Can I fire my question at you then?
Yes.
So what I've noticed and really admired in the work that you have both done is actually what came from the audience question back here earlier today, which was, we always think of institutions as these big organizations, when in fact, quite often they're extremely informal. And what I've noticed is that you have both, throughout your careers, worked in environments where you have blended work with formal organizations and institutions with very informal. So I just wondered, are there any traps or massive failings we need to avoid on this kind of work, given that I think everybody here knows that we need to work with both formal and informal institutions? Jess, do you want to dive in?
Since we only have 4 minutes and 5 seconds left, I'll just say the first thing that comes to mind is the biggest failing, I think, in my decades of trying to do this, is to not prioritize and take the time for the informal. For the human part was always, in some ways, nights and weekends extra. And it's very easy when you're faced with the unspeakable topics. I lived and worked in India I worked in India for about 20 years, lived there for 11 years, so a lot of my experiences in institutional design came from different policy areas there. And it's very easy to, when you're faced with the enormity of an infrastructure challenge, or transport governance, or solid waste in a city of 25 million people, to go analytical. And to go analytical fast, because that's the convenient sort of safe space, and that's been the safe space for me, is to go analytical. And I don't think and I think the recognition over the years is that that's neither the way in which I am most effective, nor is it the most effective type of advice. So I did some work with the national government on air quality policy. And part of it was trying to formalize relationships between the State Pollution Control Board and sharing information about pollution sources, what are the best and most cost-effective ways to use the information that they had. What I realized halfway through is that they were already doing it. There was a WhatsApp group among Pollution Control Board officials and a number of different scientists across different institutions that was functioning on a day-to-day basis to try to figure out what part was interstate, what part was whatever. And by formalizing it into interstate arrangements and some, law that forced states to compensate each other on the basis of attributed pollution, would basically wreck that incredibly functional network. And so going straight to analytical without taking the time to look at the personal, understand the personal, respect the personal, reinforce the personal, is often a mistake, both personally as well as professionally, in what you're trying to achieve. And I hope that forums like this can build a greater recognition of that mode of institutional innovation and keep open the kinds of spaces that Bridi described and that I think are helpful for us as humans and helpful for us as professionals. Edgar, you can have more than the 1 minute.
No, I'll just, so I mean, it's an astute observation, and in my experience, what I insert in, so one is I've got a very low threshold for meetings, so I'm always finding excuses to get people out of meetings. And so the one thing that really, really does the trick is whatever the policy domain is, just get into the field as a community, as a collective. Walk the sewer works, go to the minibus taxi rank, spend time and observe and collectively generate an understanding of the real world logics and dynamics of these infrastructures or spaces or whatever it is that you're trying to understand and transform. And the relationships that build through those experiences is 90% of the work. You know, then all the other stuff we're talking about here kind of just clicks into place, and also certain informal networks within the informal conversations start to congeal because people kind of hang out with people they like and they resonate with, and ultimately that's the glue that will keep any difficult transformation together, is those interpersonal dynamics. But you don't get there if you don't have, I mean, this is a very banal point, but if you don't just do stuff and get in the field, like you've got to walk together, literally, and inhabit these things and do sense making in situ. I think that's, for me, it's always been the secret sauce to get any very difficult reform to kind of get some traction and build a sense of ownership with the community of practice you're bringing together. So yeah, that's kind of my KFC secret sauce.
So I just want to thank Bridi, Edgar. Thank you so much for being on stage in a completely different conversation than we planned to have last week, but I think excellent. So thank you very much.